Good evening, British and American culture students. This is the final video lecture. The content of the class is already done, but this is supposed to be a little bit of a review to guide you, towards the right material for the exam. This is actually the final video of all of my classes and of 2020 as well. So a bit of an accomplishment, I guess, in finishing this video. So let's get right into it. As I promised, I released the scores from all the quizzes. There was a strange anomaly where a previous version of the form was released, so you got the wrong score because the correct answer in two of the questions, the answer had been changed. I had corrected a previous version of the form. I don't know how that happened. But a student brought it to my attention. So I released a second version after I'd corrected the mistake. So the higher grade that you got is the correct one that is in the spreadsheet. You don't have to worry. The first question was a question about the natives, and the correct answer was Algonquin, not Arawak. And the second question was about the British North America Act of 1867, which of course the right answer was it created a new country, the Dominion of Canada, a future new country. So because of that error, I released the grades for quiz number 6 twice. Quiz number 6 gave us lots of problems, so hopefully those problems are resolved. I looked at it, and the second set of released grades should be correct. Now, lots of people missed quizzes for technical reasons or because they were just lazy. So if you didn't get a quiz because you didn't do it, what I did was consolidate all the quizzes into one scanned file. There wasn't an easy way to extract the questions and answers out of the Google form. I looked it up online, and the tutorials didn't provide me an easy way of doing that. So what I did is I just printed all of the quizzes, scanned them into one file, so you can look them up and you can practice the quizzes. The answers are not there, but if you missed the quiz or you skipped it, that's your fault. I gave the answers twice. If you took the quiz, you got the answers, and of course, if you watch the video lectures, you get the answers as well. So you have to look them up. If there's a particular question that you think is difficult or not clear, you don't know why it's the answer, you can send me an email, and I am getting swamped by emails right now because assignments are being handed in, but I should be able to get back to you if it's a good question. Certainly I would be happy to point it out why that is the correct answer. But all the answers should be easy for you to find, given a few minutes of looking through the textbook, looking up the correct video lecture, or looking at your notes. So without further ado, this is the Fall 2020 study guide. I'm just going to basically list important things that you should look up. And I've already done this in the Zoom lecture, so this is going to be short, and I'm just gonna go through, basically the 12 weeks, because we did have a midterm week, the 12 weeks that we had material, and point to the major things that we talked about. So going back to the beginning, you do need to know about the different cultures that invaded the island of Great Britain, the British Isles, which would be the Celts, the Romans, the Germans, and the Danes, what their impact was. Remember, the stuff from before the midterm is just on multiple choice. We talked about the legend of King Arthur and of Robin Hood, Canute the Great, King Alfred. We skipped over Edward the Confessor, so don't worry about him. And then we talked about the Norman Conquest and William the Conqueror. Thomas Becket was the first English celebrity because he got his head chopped in half by some of Henry II's henchmen, and this created the Canterbury Shrine, which is the backdrop for the famous writing by Chaucer, the Canterbury Tales. After that, after the second week of stuff, this is all basically from the first quiz. We talked about the medieval period, especially the Magna Carta in 1215, which was an important document that reduced the power of the king and increased the influence of the barons and gave more rights to all people. Basic things like you needed to be put on trial, not just executed out of hand. We discussed in detail the great chain of being with God at the top and basic organic stuff at the bottom, the plants and animals below, and ranks of humans in between, from slaves and peasants all the way up to barons, dukes, princes, kings, and the Pope. There was a great famine in 1315. That number is very easy to remember because it's 100 years after the Magna Carta. That made everybody sick and weak. And so in the middle of the century, in the 1340s, when the Black Death came through the Crimea into the Mediterranean, into Italy, and finally made its way to the British Isles, a lot of people were already unhealthy, and the Black Death devastated the population. Remember though, because all those people, there were obviously the population had, there was some overpopulation because the weather had been good. And there were too many people already. So it was sort of a population correction, you might say, but it was overcorrected. And the results were, the breakdown of communication and trade and, loss of all kinds of expertise and the loss of reputation in the Catholic Church because so many trained people, ministers, priests, bishops, and so on died. The clergy became younger and less educated and less professional. And so it damaged the reputation of the church a lot. People didn't know what the reason was for the Black Death, so it caused a lot of chaos. People blamed all sorts of things. There was racism, there was superstition, there was disbelief and depression, and it was a very chaotic, unstable time. But out of that situation came some disruption to the chain of being, because the chain of being was very organized. But when you kill off whole sections of that chain, and there's no continuity, you end up with people being able to move up and down in society. So you had basically wages increasing because people who owned land needed labor. There were less people. And when there's less people, you can ask for more. So there was freedom and an increase in the economic welfare of the people who survived. And these are several of the things that were good things for English society. And when things started to go back to normal, a generation later, the rich people, of course, tried to take them back. They wanted everybody to be paid less and to work on their land and do what they're told and be satisfied with their position at the bottom of the chain of being. But they weren't. So then there was the Peasant Revolt of 1381. Okay, I've got to move quicker than this, otherwise this will take a long time. So then there's Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote Canterbury Tales, and he grew up during the time of the Black Death and the Peasant Revolt. John Wycliffe also was very influential because some of his ideas are proto-Protestant. The people who followed him were called the Lollards. Then we go into the 16th century. The end of the 100 Years' War was 1453 and France won. Also Constantinople was taken by the Turks in the same year. So we have all the Tudors, and I'm not going to go into detail about them because I did enough. We've got Henry VII, he dies. Henry VIII, he's the important one who has multiple children and 6 wives, some of which he kills. And his 3 children have each get a turn, with Elizabeth having the longest and most important reign of the 3. During that whole period, Henry VIII starts something called the Reformation, which is essentially the real revolution of English society. If you can point to any period in English culture and history, that's the most revolutionary period, is the one started by Henry VIII and the Act of Supremacy in 1534. So then you have all the stuff associated with that. Protestants and Catholics, Presbyterians, Anglicans, Puritans, Dissenters, Diggers. You have pirates and exploration, and in 1588, the Spanish Armada. Shakespeare comes along and writes a lot of great stuff. Then we get into the 17th century, where Elizabeth dies without ever having a husband, and she doesn't have any heir, so her nephew, King James, comes down from Scotland with his skinny legs and his strangely shaped head and his big tongue. He starts colonizing America, and that sort of carries over into the American section. He rules for a while, then Charles gets on the throne, but Charles can't get along with Parliament, so there's a civil war, and the result of that is he gets his head cut off. You have to look up the details. Oliver Cromwell takes over and declares a commonwealth, and then that doesn't work very well, so he declares a protectorate, and then he dies. There's about 10 years where England is not a monarchy. And then nothing's going very well after Cromwell dies, because they needed his leadership. And so everyone decides that actually it was better having a king, just not one that thinks he's absolute. So they invite Charles II, the son of the king whose head they cut off, to come back and be the king. What a weird event. He rules for a while, and everybody's suspicious that he might be Catholic, but there's never any proof. But when he dies without a son, his brother, James II, is Catholic. And they don't like that at all. And he's trying to make England Catholic again, but it's a little bit too late for that. Most people are very strongly Protestant. So they give William III, the William of Orange from the Netherlands, a call, because he's married to the daughter of James, and ask him to come over and be the king. So he sails across the English Channel, and luckily for him, the wind is blowing the right way, and he lands with no problem, and James runs away. This is called the Glorious Revolution, mostly because nobody died. The king just got replaced, and the power of Parliament and the influence, the representation of people in the Parliament, the influence over the king was secured without the Civil War, without thousands and thousands of people dying. So that's why it's glorious. Right, and then we come to the hard fork. This is moving into the material for the second half of the class. I talked about the key ideas in American culture. Freedom, obviously, very important. There is this idea called manifest destiny, that Americans, God has chosen them, they're a chosen people, and they have a destiny to be great. This ties into all of the things that they think. You can say things like, we talked about contradiction and individualism. All of these things, if I ask you to talk about what are some key ideas that persist throughout American culture, you can talk about these things and give me examples. I also referred to Alan Gelzo's concepts. He said education as a means to gain equality and opportunity, popular government, which means voting and being represented in government, the right of the people to rule themselves, right? A government for the people, by the people, and of the people, as Abraham Lincoln said. And a people that are always willing to experiment and try something new, constantly inventing stuff. Even if it's dangerous and risky, the Americans are the ones that are usually ready to give it a chance. And like I just said, manifest destiny. They believe in themselves. They have confidence that they are special. And this is one of the things that sometimes annoys other cultures about America, is they're not quiet about the fact that they think they're special. It is a good thing. It makes them achieve great things, but it's also a sort of proud attitude. And certainly other proud countries that have great cultures, I can think of, the British or perhaps the Chinese or the French, they might find an American attitude that they're the best and they're the special a little bit on the annoying side. But you know, it has driven them to do great things, and that's the good side of the coin, right? So it does have its. There are two sides to that perception. So we started off talking about what it was like before America was a country, Christopher Columbus especially, how each colony had kind of a unique character. There's lots of different religions and different attitudes and dialects, and they actually come from different parts of Great Britain. England, Scotland, Ireland, and then later Great Britain. It's still not actually Great Britain until 1707. Okay, so then the 7 Years' War, which sometimes people call the War for Empire, the British win. So then the French are kicked out of North America, but they only last about 20 years before they start arguing with themselves. And between the taxes and acts and the soldiers being garrisoned and the insults to Benjamin Franklin, basically the British drive the colonists into a situation where they think that independence is preferable to staying in the British Empire. It didn't have to go that way, but that's the way it did. So they went into open rebellion, and then there was the American Revolutionary War, which was won by the Americans primarily with the leadership of George Washington and the writing skill and direction of Thomas Jefferson's pen, and the reputation and diplomatic skill of Benjamin Franklin, among other people, but those are the three that I mentioned. Of course, slavery was one of the original contradictions. The Constitution gave rights to everyone except people who were slaves. So all people are people except for people who are enslaved. It doesn't make any sense. So that's the sixth section. Then we talked about industrialization and imperialism. You need to know some of the key inventions: the steam engine, the spinning jenny, the primary factors in industrialization. Steam, iron, and textiles were the main ingredients. Disadvantages and advantages of imperialism. A little bit about Horatio Nelson and why he was important. The meaning of Pax Britannica, which is the control of the sea. And about Victorianism and Victoria. We talked about that in a lecture as well. Sea power, Nelson, Victoria, and Pax Britannica are basically the British things you need to know about the 19th century. Then we moved back to America again, where at the beginning of the 19th century, not so many Americans were religious. The Puritan fervor and fanaticism and dedication and devotion to religion had sort of ebbed and calmed and diluted. And at the beginning of the 19th century, it revived. And that religious revival is called the Great Awakening. And the number of churches multiplied exponentially. So now we have in America that is quite religious compared to Canada, Great Britain, Ireland, or any of the other Western cultures. None of them have the same dedication to going to church and religious attitudes as Americans do. So that had long-term effects. There was a transportation revolution. They dug some canals to transport goods across America, but even more important were the railroads that got people all the way into the interior and eventually across to the Pacific Ocean. This westward expansion was expansion was driven by manifest destiny, the belief that the native people weren't really taking advantage of the land the way a civilized, advanced people should, so they didn't deserve it. This is obviously something they just made up to justify stealing the land from the people who were already there. One of the things that attracted people to the West Coast was the gold rush. And then we got into the Civil War because the states that were relying on slavery as their labor to produce products like cotton and tobacco and other things did not want to lose their influence over the government, and they were already outnumbered. So they wanted the new states and the new territories to also be allowed to be slave states, or to be slave states, to insist that they would be slave states. But the North refused to do that, and so they went to war, and the South lost. We talked about the Native Americans, in particular, the Sioux, Algonquin, Iroquois, Arawak, and Apache. The Trail of Tears is the event when the Cherokee who live in Georgia are displaced by Andrew Jackson and the Georgia government. Not so much by Andrew Jackson, but Andrew Jackson just allows the Georgia government to forcefully remove them and march them west off of their land towards the Mississippi, and it's remembered as a terrible tragedy in the history of the Native people. Paul Bunyan was a mythical figure who the tall tale was told to generations of Americans to make them feel like they all belonged. Davy Crockett was a real person who was a politician and a soldier and a hunter. He's a very interesting man, and he died at the Alamo. And we did mention that although the Civil War was over and some people were making huge amounts of money, Andrew Carnegie, Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, and Vanderbilt and others, these great industrialists, some people were making huge fortunes, but the South was still damaged. The Reconstruction period was very difficult, and on the surface it looked like the economy was robust and healthy and growing, and people were wealthy. But if you looked closer at the majority of the people and the damage to the country, it was just on gold, like on the surface. So they referred to it as the Gilded Age, like something that looks really shiny and valuable on the surface, but underneath is sort of low quality and not as good as you think. Then to the 20th century, we talked about World War I and modernism and how that was so important in shaping, this like sort of revolutionary leap in perspective. People were still stuck in the Napoleonic style of fighting and thinking about things in two dimensions, and all of a sudden this 4 or 5 year period transformed all sorts of technology, politics. It's sort of the death of empires as well. All sorts of new political ideas, philosophies, art, everything sort of gets transformed. You go in, you look at pre World War I, and you see Europe in perhaps its golden age, in the late 19th century, and then you see it completely, it's horrible, human greed and destructive power released in the war, and then it comes out the other side modern, full of machines and dark, and distance from that romantic idea of war and life and other things. So very, very pivotal moment in European history. America managed to stay out of most of it, so it didn't have this sort of dark effect on American society. So America actually started to flex its muscle and expand a little bit more. They did leave after participating in World War I, but basically they profited from World War I because they sold equipment and they produced a lot of machines and ammunition, foodstuffs, materials, resources were all delivered to the various powers in Europe who were fighting, and so they had got a huge economic benefit without very much damage, at least domestically. So American innovation and their late participation in World War I is their main advantage. Then we talked about how the American century was essentially, it could be divided this way, that the first 25 years or so are very optimistic, too optimistic, as it turned out, too optimistic, but they avoided all of the damage of World War I, and the economy was humming along. People had lots of jobs, stocks were going up, new technologies were being developed, movies and everything. Entertainment was sports teams were being created and entertainment was growing. Everything looked great, and then they slammed into the Great Depression because, again, just like the Gilded Age, they sort of everything looked perfect on the outside, but underneath it was sort of rotting away. Primarily it was the result of weakness in agriculture, farmers defaulting on their land, and lack of demand for products. So people couldn't pay for their debts and pay for their land and pay their taxes, and they defaulted. And the banks who were lending money to people weren't receiving payments, and there was sort of like a cascade. And it ended up with Black Monday and Black Tuesday, but Black Monday is the first day when the New York Stock Exchange opened and it crashed. Everybody tried to sell their stocks at the same time. So I already just did these lectures, so I won't repeat myself. The American Century is the one that we did last week, and we did a quiz, number 7, just a couple days ago. Not even a couple days ago, just yesterday. So that should be fresh. The American Century, you need to know all about that, and you need to know about Hollywood and American entertainment culture, and that is the whole course in 25 minutes. Now, there may be a few things that I have missed. That's okay. It's up to you to look at your notes and look at the video lectures in detail. I'm not saying that everything I said today is the only things that are on the exam. I'm just pointing you to the major things. So make sure you fill in the gaps, because there are 42 questions, and you should look over your quizzes as well, look over your notes, and refer to your midterm, and then you should have all the knowledge that you need to ace the exam. That is the review. So hopefully there's no further problems. Remember to look up on the website. At the bottom, there's a link to the 7 quizzes, and just above that, it has a class list to tell you which room you belong in. And that's the 143rd video I've done this semester. This year. 2020 has been a terrible year. So in honor of this 143rd video on YouTube, and in honor of you guys, my faithful students, I'm going to drink some of the good stuff. And this is Korea, so this looks like red ginseng 6 year. So you got to celebrate once you get to 143 lectures online, right? Yeah, I hope that's healthy. Anyway, the coronavirus is everywhere. That's it for this year. That's the end of 2020 video lectures. I hope you enjoyed the class. I love teaching this class. It's my favorite. And I look forward to seeing all of you in person December 10th at 10 o'clock in the Humanities Building, room 456 or room 124. Have a great weekend and good luck studying.